Once again, I get to introduce Chris Lloyd, who is a senior architect here at Oxford Computer Group in the U.S. Chris has been with us nearly 4 years, and he is also our information protection product lead. Those of you that follow the Microsoft product releases know that in the security space they have been very aggressive in releasing new products, and Chris stays absolutely on top of it all and implements those in some of our largest accounts here in our U.S. customer base. Chris has a long history of deploying large-scale IDM solutions, including role-based access control for large healthcare systems. He's done about 120 healthcare systems in his career, and that's just one of the verticals that he works in. You'll also notice throughout this presentation that Chris will be talking a little bit about how these authentication methods for Office 365 will also influence the reporting for compliance. So governance, risk, and compliance is something that our customers have been asking us increasingly about, and we've been responding with more services. And I won't take any more time. I will just go ahead and introduce Chris Lloyd. Oh, Chris, you reminded me I have to also introduce our next topics. Next month we're going to be doing security transformation, and in May we have our CISO forum and technical forum. It's a 2-day presentation in New York City, and we will be sending out invitations to those of you who are in that geographic area. So be looking for that. Now I'll go ahead and hand it off to Chris.
All right. Thanks, Steve. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I just wanted to put a quick poll out there, and I'll launch it right now. And if you guys could just take a quick second, if you're using Office 365, if you could just enter in which method of authentication you're currently using, just so I understand where everybody's at. I'm currently seeing a lot of ADFS. That's kind of winning it right now. And I'm going to close the poll now and we'll continue on, but I appreciate you giving me your answers. Thank you. So some of the considerations that you want to take into effect when you are implementing Office 365, and this actually goes for anything, we're just focusing on Office 365, but really does the password, from a Microsoft perspective on the options that we have for choosing an authentication strategy and platform for Office 365, can I do password hash synchronization to the cloud? Will my security and compliance departments, will they sign off on that? One of the other ones is, are we capable of hosting our own identity provider? I've been to a lot of organizations that struggle with that, and a lot of them were shoehorned into setting up ADFS and hosting that, and they weren't really comfortable with it, but they, whoever did the initial implementation, whether it was done internally or by some other consulting company, they may have been shoehorned into setting up ADFS and hosting it themselves. Another item to consider is do we need special conditional access policies? And Microsoft has made some pretty interesting and exciting strides in enabling that. And there's several different ways you can do access control policies, and we'll briefly touch on those during the presentation. And then, do we need to have account disablement to be immediate? And not only disablement, but do we need to have, are we using logon restriction times? So there's different ways on the different authentication methods on how they respect that, and if they respect it at all. So at the core of authentication is really enabling the business. That is its goal. We have to allow users to gain access to Office 365 resources. We also want to minimize and mitigate the risk of unplanned downtime. We need to enable users to be able to sign in seamlessly, and they need to be able to know that this is where they should sign in. It has a company branded logo. It's very consistent across the board to not have confusion with your end users. And then right along with authentication, we have multi-factor authentication and conditional access when it's necessary for sensitive apps. A lot of places go overboard and they do MFA on everything, and that's fine if that's their company policy. But it's also a way to let's think about MFA and using it when it makes sense. And the last, but probably one of the most important for some of your people in your organization, is the lowest possible cost of ownership of that authentication mechanism. So right off the bat, we'll just dive right in here. We'll talk about password hash sync, and this has been around for quite some time. This is basically taking the binary form of the MD4 hash and converting it into a 32-byte uppercase hexadecimal string. There's some additional encryption that's being done on it. I don't want to go into too much detail, but because it's pretty readily available. They're using a SHA-256 hash-based message authentication, and then it's sent up to the cloud. A lot of times I get the question, is this secure? It's a proven algorithm. They're using password-based key derivation function 2, which has been pretty proven. It can't be converted back into the original NT hash, which means it's resistant to, against, it can't be used in the hash the hash scenario. It's also resistant to rainbow table attacks due to the salt being added. I think it uses 10 bytes of salt, and I think 8 is the usual suggested salt that's used on that type of function. So passwords changed in Active Directory. They are synchronized to the hashes are synchronized to the cloud, and then when a user logs in, the hashes are compared and then allows the user access. So when to use this? So when would be a great time to use password hash sync? Simplified deployments is a great example. So a lot of places just want a simple mechanism to allow users to access Office 365, and this is one of the easiest. It also allows for simple integration with Azure MFA. And when I say Azure MFA, I'm talking about the cloud-based MFA. Those of you who have deployed the Azure MFA server, which is the on-premise variant of that, they hopefully will see a time when they have a migration strategy from that. But for those of you that have not implemented either one of those MFAs, you really should be looking at the cloud-only MFA at this point. The server has specific use cases that you may need to use, but the cloud MFA is where the direction is heading. So why would we not use it? Why would we not use password hash sync? We need account disablement to be immediate. So in Azure AD Connect, which is the synchronization engine that is sending information and those passwords to Azure Active Directory, that's only running every 30 minutes. So if I disable an end user in Active Directory, that will not be replicated to the cloud for 30 minutes. Meaning if I disable user, immediate termination, they technically have that 30-minute window before that sync happens and disables the account in the cloud. The other item that's not on this list, but if you're using account logon restrictions in Active Directory, those will not be respected in this authentication scenario as well. Also, if you're using another MFA for provider, this isn't probably going to be a great choice for you unless that it can hook in some form or fashion. Some of them can, but some of the MFA integrations, this won't work well with, because you'd need that MFA challenge to happen through another party that's then going to transfer you over to Office 365. And then another one is you need to be able to filter out specific Office 365 services depending on the location of the client. Now this has gotten a lot better with conditional access, which is built into Azure AD and part of the Enterprise Mobility Suite. But if you don't have that, the only way to really do that is through using ADFS and writing some custom claim rules within ADFS. And in ADFS 2016, that got a lot easier because they actually improved the graphical user interface to accommodate that rather than having to write those confusing ADFS claims rules. Which brings us right into ADFS. So this is, as my poll has deemed, and everyone out there listening, most of you are using Active Directory Federation services. Now, this was one of the, when we started rolling out Office 365 years ago, this was the de facto standard for most large organizations to roll out, and there is nothing wrong with ADFS. I'm not preaching against ADFS. It is a great platform, and it enables great integration with Office 365 and Azure AD. So identities are synchronized to Azure Active Directory. When a user authenticates, they log in or they enter their email address. Office 365 is then responsible for routing them back to Active Directory Federation Services where the user is authenticated, and it respects the logon disabled because it is using Active Directory as its authentication or attribute store. So when to use it? When you want to have domain join single sign-on, that's one of the key areas where this excels. You're having a domain join workstation, you're going to connect Office 365 with your web browser, it's going to automatically sign you in. You need to be able to I talked about that before, filtering out the specific Office 365 services. Maybe you only want to have the Outlook web app accessible externally, and personnel can't use an Outlook FAT client externally outside of your network. It's just a sample use case. If you use another MFA provider, there's MFA providers that provide hook-ins to ADFS so that when the authentication happens, we then have to challenge the MFA, the user with MFA using that other provider other than Azure MFA. Additional branding or customization might be needed. The password hash sync, there is some limited customization that you can do. With ADFS, you own it, and you can customize it to your heart's content. There's all sorts of different customizations and implementations I've seen with using ADFS. Again, the more you customize things, then the more it's harder to maintain. It requires a certain knowledge level to keep that going and to be able to upgrade it into the new platform. And then why not to use it? So it requires significant infrastructure and planning. We've got to make sure, what types of topologies for ADFS do I need to use? Do I use Windows internal database? Do I use SQL Server as the back end? Do I need this to be geo-redundant? So I need to make sure I can load balance across different data centers. There's a lot that goes into it. There's the procurement of SSL certificates, and just understanding. And it may be a very complex environment that you're doing this with. Maybe it's a resource forest model with maybe 10, 20 different Active Directory forests across the board. And then when it goes down, no one can get into Office 365. That is a big one for a lot of people, especially when you're on vacation and that ADFS server goes down and you get that phone call and it's like, oh, now we've got to go in there and fix our environment. With password hash synchronization, the ownership is really on Microsoft. There is that component that is synchronizing the passwords to the cloud, and that's important to keep in mind as well as far as your infrastructure. But having your ADFS server or farm go down is a big deal when you've connected it to Office 365. All right. Now, hopefully, most of you have heard of those two, ADFS and password hash synchronization. This is recent. And so Microsoft recently released Passthrough Authentication as another mechanism for authentication. And this is kind of the driving strategy of what Microsoft is really going for right now. It's the reduction of infrastructure needed in your on-premise environment. Everything they're doing, whether it be Azure MFA with the cloud variant, especially MFA now that they have the NPS adapter, which speaks radius to your on-premise VPN clients or anything else that needs to speak radius, whether it be the Azure App Proxy. These are all very low footprint, not needing an external, much of an external access point to be able to facilitate your cloud existence. And so Passthrough Authentication works in much of the same way as we think of the Azure App Proxy. So the identities are still synchronized with Azure AD Connect. There's a special option in there now to enable Passthrough Authentication. And the authentication, when a user signs in, is being transmitted back to this component on this server, which can be, you can have multiple servers with this component in there for redundancy, but the authentication is being done on Windows Server Active Directory, meaning that it's going to respect your login restrictions or account disablement because it's being done at that point. So this is a quick diagram. It actually looks very similar to how we would think ADFS would work, just without the SAML part. So we're not, or WS Fed. So it's very similar. I really don't have to go into it. It's exactly what you would expect. I'm logging in, authenticating against Active Directory, getting the return result back to Office 365 that it was a yes or no, and allowing the user access.
Hey, Chris, there's a couple of questions
I'm sorry.
That you may want to address. Normally I would, but I think you're going to need to answer these.
Sorry about that.
And for the rest of the group, can ADFS support multiple domains in a forest and/or trusted domains? Is one of them. Or does it require an ADFS environment for each domain?
So if it is a trusted, if you have a trusted two-way trust in place with your forest, it can support that. Passthrough authentication can also support that, provided the trust is in place. And Azure AD Connect syncs the password more frequently in 30 minutes. Yes, so the password for password hash synchronization on AD Connect is done immediately. It's done in real time as the user is changing the password. What is not done in real time is the synchronization of the account enablement. So if I flip the bit on user account control, that's not going to be, that's synchronized during the normal sync process. The password synchronization, password hash synchronization, is actually done out of band of the 30-minute sync cycle. So pass-through authentication. So when to use it, we want to have the disablement or immediate logon restrictions enforced. This also creates that simplified deployment. We're starting to hit that nice happy medium of what a lot of customers of mine have been asking for. We get to easily integrate Azure MFA. And so why might we not want to use this? We don't really have that filtering, but that might be taken into account with conditional access. And if the connectors do go down, that does mean no one can get into Office 365. However, we can have multiple different connectors so that we can account for redundancy. And then legacy active sync clients are not supported in this mechanism. So we're thinking not Outlook client, older things that are still using active sync are not supported. What you can do with this is you can use pass-through authentication and still have password hash sync running at the same time. You can actually do that with ADFS as well, and I have some organizations that have that configured so that if ADFS did go down, they could convert over to password hash synchronization, and they wouldn't need to trigger an immediate sync of the passwords because they've been synchronizing all along, and they just have to run a few PowerShell commands to convert their domain back into a managed state. Last thing about password authentication, it's in public preview, which we know from the Microsoft terms means it's in its final stage of beta. So talking about some of the compliance items with these, where are the authentication logs stored? How would I aggregate them? So password hash sync, all the authentication logs are in Azure. So every time a user logs in, that's being logged in Azure. In fact, every time, with the way it's set up now, all the authentications are being logged in Azure. But if you have ADFS, then you have additional logs that are on your ADFS servers, specifically around errors or bad attempts at trying to access, and these need to be aggregated, and that can be done in a variety of ways. The simplest and cheapest would be Windows event log forwarding, but you could use a third-party tool, a Splunk, or some other event log collection mechanism. And pass-through authentication is done the same way as ADFS. There are event logs on the connector servers, and they need to be aggregated in the same way. So Azure AD Connect Health and identity protection are useful tools with dealing with some of these, the compliance and regulatory items here. And looking at Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, this is a really neat product that's offered. It's with the EMS E5 SKU. So if you're not familiar, the EMS suite was broken up into two different SKUs recently. We have E3 and E5, and this is on the E5 SKU. And this allows Microsoft, and this is independent of the authentication mechanism that you've chosen. So this works with ADFS, works with password hash sync, pass-through authentication. So this is completely independent of the authentication method chosen, but allows you to, Microsoft, which is looking at doing, I can't remember the last count, but it's a large number of authentications a day, and they have all of their data aggregated looking for anomalous activity, meaning traveling from one place to the other. So if I log in, and I live in Nashville, so if I log in Nashville now, and then 5 minutes later somebody in Prague logs in, I probably didn't have that type of flight over there. So looking for that type of activity, and then figuring out how do you want to approach that? Do you want to then challenge the user for an MFA challenge on the next login? Do you want them to have to change their password? Or do you want to block them completely until you can do some more investigation? So a lot of the items about detection are black boxes to us because Microsoft doesn't really have an intention to publish how we're looking at these things, because then attackers could exploit that. But they have done, with the amount of authentications that they are getting, it is a good assumption that they are able to pick up on the items that they've listed here and have the ability to detect those. So that moves us into Azure AD Connect Health, and this is available with Azure AD Premium, which is available within the EMS SKU, EMS E3 or E5. This one is really good. So if you are using ADFS, or you're using Azure AD Connect to sync your identities, or you want to use this to monitor Azure, Active Directory domain services, it can monitor all three of those, and it can provide insight into problems that are occurring. So I've had ADFS proxies go down. Nobody knew about it because, if in a true load balancing sense, maybe they didn't have their load balancers with a probe on them properly, or they just didn't have it configured right. But this can really detect when there's an issue in your ADFS environment. Proxy went down, the trust relationship between the proxy and the farm servers, expired or wasn't reestablished. It also looks at, if something is running, low on memory, doesn't have enough CPU resources, can handle that. I think I've got another question.
Yep, you do. I was just about to mention that. So which identity protection features are available in E3? Not as good as E5, but they're somewhat.
So the identity protection that we were just looking at is available only in the E5, and that's to do the MFA challenges on the user. They had it in preview, and it still may be in some of your tenants, but I believe they closed that out. But it's solely in the E5 SKU. As far as the other protection mechanisms that they have, there really isn't anything that's that advanced. They do have the logs and things that you can look at to see the anomalous sign-ins, but you can't take action upon them, from that console within Azure. There's also, let's see, back on Azure Active Directory Connect Health. So we've talked about ADFS. There's sync errors. I'm sure we're all familiar with sync errors because somebody always throws up a proxy address on the two identities with the same proxy address, and those always pop up, or UPN changes that weren't authorized or allowed. The last one is Active Directory domain services, and if you install this on your domain controllers, additional data will be sent up to the cloud. Replication errors, unreachable domain controllers, things like that. Things that you don't always think about, and you may have another tool that already aggregates a lot of this stuff, but this is a very nice unified panel that will allow you to have alerts sent out via email when things go awry or astray. and it's just a very nice tool to have. They're very lightweight agents that get installed on these servers. They auto-update themselves, and they really don't get in the way of anything. In fact, on the DCs, I know they employ the same tactic as the advanced threat analytics, where if it's not if the CPU is pegged or it's really something's hammering the DC, it'll duck out of the way and say, nope, that's the actual domain controller's operation is more important than me sending logs up. So how it works, we're really just sending data to Azure Active Directory from those three components. You don't have to install it on all of those, but if you're paying for it, it definitely makes sense to take a look at the very least, on ADFS and Azure AD Connect. Active Directory, maybe, you know, I've talked to some people who don't really like to put agents on domain controllers, and I totally understand that. You know, that's up to you all to make that assessment. Definitely worth testing, though. You can throw it up on a single domain controller, and you'd still get some data. You just won't have the entire access, and so that's all transmitted over port 44380 and 5671. I forget what 5671 is doing, but I'm sure I could look that up. So this is an example of the Active Directory domain services monitoring. You know, some of the different alerts that you can get from that data. This is fairly unhealthy looking, and it actually makes my skin crawl looking at some of this stuff. Having dealt with items like this in the past. All right, so since I'm talking to a bunch of ADFS geeks, ADFS has been released in Windows Server 2016 if you haven't already upgraded. And they have actually made the upgrade path to ADFS on 2016 a lot easier than in the past. You can actually stand up ADFS server 2016 with ADFS. A 2016 server can be stood up in a 2012 R2 farm. It will act. They have a new thing called a functional level, so we've got another functional level to worry about along with our Active Directory levels. And so you can slide in ADFS servers on server 2016 and then decommission the 2012 R2 ones, and then you can promote that functional level to a 2016 level. And so what does this get us? So we've got Azure MFA built right into the product now, as well as Passport enabling Windows Hello. To do that, there's some additional schema enhancements needed for Active Directory. We've also got LDAP version 3 directory support, meaning I can point ADFS at LDAP directories, which previously would have been a lot more challenging. But so now we've got that built right in. We can do custom images per relying party. So if you've really, gone wild with ADFS and you've got it configured for Salesforce or for all sorts of different SaaS applications or your custom applications, you could brand it with custom images per those relying parties, creating an entirely new experience for your end users. We've got some new auditing levels within the product. It's not that revolutionary. We've also got the in-common federation with the eGov 2.0 standard, and a lot of universities use this, but they're doing it with Shibboleth. But they've also got ADFS at a lot of these different universities, and they've got 2 different federation points. Not saying you should get rid of your Shibboleth environment, but it might be something to look at now that we have support for it with ADFS. There's access control templates as well that enable you to perform some of those things I was talking about earlier with restricting access based on the location of the client. And there's actually a delegated service management, so you don't have to be an admin on the box, the actual servers to manage ADFS. Last item I think we're going to talk about, I think I had another, let me answer some questions first. Active Directory Domain Services Monitoring is part of E5. Oh, sorry, no, part of E3. I apologize. I read that wrong. That is part of Azure AD Connect Health, which is part of Azure Active Directory Premium, which is part of EMS E3 and E5. Whew, they've made that a mouthful. And let's see, can AD Connect Health be leveraged for federation portion if using ping instead of ADFS? Health. So yeah, so it's not going to monitor ping, but you could use it. You could still use it to monitor domain services and the Azure AD Connect. So it could monitor those too, but it's not going to be monitoring the actual ping functionality. And I think we can get a copy of the slides after we're done, definitely. So seamless single sign-on. If you remember at the beginning when I was talking about why you would use ADFS, one of the things on there was single sign-on on a domain joined machine. And with pass-through authentication, if you employ that, you have the option to employ seamless single sign-on. I think you can actually do it. Oh, I don't want to say that. I'm going to say it. You need pass-through authentication, but my brain, somewhere in my brain, I'm thinking that you can do it with password hash sync, but I'm not going to make that statement. I'll relook at that. I can't remember. But this is basically doing Kerberos authentication to get Kerberos tickets just like you would in an ADFS environment, but it's actually being done on your Active Directory, and it's almost like ADFS. The difference is with this mechanism, the user still has to put their email address or UPN in the login form in Office. Once that is done, then it's the same way you would do it. It logs the user in because they're in a domain joined workstation. It got the Kerberos ticket and logged the user in. So it's not exactly the same because in an ADFS environment, the user would not see the login page. They would be automatically signed in using ADFS. But because there's no home realm discovery, if you don't have ADFS, you got to tell it who you are. I believe that is it. I have one more poll.
Actually, Chris, if anyone has, no, you got all the questions, but I was going to encourage people to type in new questions. This would be a good time to put them in there.
All right, while they're typing in new questions, I have one more poll, which is rather silly. And apparently when I made this video, I had another video that actually had a cat in it. And if you haven't seen this video, I don't encourage you to go seek it out. But we're seeing that if you actually came because of the cat and you really don't care about authentication, that'd be amazing to know, because if you sat through this entire thing and didn't care about authentication, just wanted to see if I'd have a cat, you know, I do apologize. But
oh, Chris, you're getting a lot of competition from the cat here in the poll.
But that is all I have, and I encourage you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and I'll turn it back over to Steve.
Well, I don't have anything to add. That was great. Thanks very much, Chris, for prepping that for this month. And as a reminder, we'll be sending out invites for our upcoming monthly webinars as well. Thanks all for attending. We actually had a very good attendance this month, and hey, Chris, as many people, more people here at the end than were at the beginning. So they must have liked you, or the cat. We're still trying to figure that out.
Well, that's great. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.